even before this November's US elections, Republican candidate Donald Trump's already taken control of at least one landmark building in the nation's capital, and South Africa's Trade Minister Rob Davies is here hosting a business briefing at the five-star Trump International to encourage American investors to look beyond their borders.
I think if the world doesn't embrace the idea of inclusive growth, we're going to have forces that are going to, I think, knock multilateralism hard. President Obama said at the UN the other day, it can't be that we all sit together, but the biggest and strongest among us simply lecture and are didactic towards the smallest and weakest of us. It must be an honest conversation in which we all understand each other's issues and work together for the common good.
Minister Davies is offering reassurance that South Africa's working hard at home to improve economic prospects following a period of weak growth, with the threat of the country's debt rating falling below its prized investment grade.
And I think the first thing and the most important thing about it is to try to inject more growth into our economy for the benefit of our own economy and our own people. But if that also helps us to avoid a ratings downgrade, that would be important as well.
Minister Davies was speaking as President Jacob Zuma and Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan appeared publicly together in order to dispel reports of a major power struggle over recent corruption probes and a former rogue surveillance unit at the nation's tax agency.
Many other countries have also got lively political processes, and I think we want to say that our institutions are all holding, our constitution is holding, and indeed that policy certainty is something that we are trying to work towards.
Minister Davies wants US corporate investors like Tesla, founded and run by South African-born Elon Musk, to consider following the example of Germany's BMW and set up manufacturing facilities. With that in mind, Minister Davies will be heading up the South African delegation next week, discussing ways to better take advantage of the tariff-free benefits of the AGOA trade scheme. Daniel Ryntjes, CCTV, Washington.
Now, of course, the 15th AGOA Forum is currently on in Washington, and Daniel Ryntjes now joins us from there with the latest. Daniel, welcome to the show. Now, as you mentioned earlier there, Africa does have another decade of AGOA, but has Africa been able to maximize on its benefits? We know countries like South Africa have struggled to take full advantage of the program. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, AGOA isn't a magic wand, but what we've seen, obviously, over the last few months is a growing realization that many countries in Africa that have relied on their export earnings being commodities have come to the realization that that's simply not enough and that they need to diversify. You cannot just have a tariff barrier lowered and then expect goods and services to flow over those in a magical way. You have to create the conditions on the supply of those products that will work. So the biggest barriers to trade to the United States of African countries are usually issues that are not related to the tariffs themselves. The tariffs are an incentive. So, for example, with agricultural products, you might have some agricultural products growing very nicely in the fields, but no means in which to bring them into the major cities and then transport them to the ports and bring them over to the United States. And then on top of that, you have to deal with what they call sanitary and phytosanitary standards. That means sort of safety and reliability of those products as to the US standards. So there's very detailed reasons. So in the case of South Africa, you have a very developed industrial base that's able to manufacture BMW cars and bring them over to the United States. But it has to have all of those things in place in the home country before they're able to be successful in diversifying. So I think moving forward, we're going to see a lot more of this emphasis on the diversification of markets in Africa and also trying to find ways in which they can practically bring these things over to the United States and sell much more product.
Now, going forward, we do expect U.S. trade policy to change. We know the November presidential elections are coming up. What are your thoughts on the future of AGOA under a new president, whether Democrat or Republican?
Well, I think under the Democrats, Hillary Clinton was obviously U.S. Secretary of State and presided over a good number of years of Africa policy. So the guess would be that things continue in a similar way. But with the Republican candidate, we have a good deal of uncertainty about how his policy prescriptions will work. He's tended to talk in sort of grandiose terms about the sort of trade policies that he would go forward with. But he hasn't talked in any detail about what his Africa policy is likely to be. So that's creating a certain level of uncertainty. And I think most of the trade ministers here will take the view, well, let's just see what happens in the election, and then we'll just have to deal with whatever comes next.
Now, give us some insight into some of the key solutions that have come out of this forum, and of course that will improve U.S. trade relations with the continent.
Well, a little bit of context here. The US has recently published a report looking at what would happen after the current round of AGOA, which is another 9 years. What would happen then in a post-AGOA context? And there is a suggestion here of what they call reciprocity. So up until now and for the next 9 years, African countries can export into the United States without tariffs on thousands of different product lines, but there's no sense in which barriers to US products going into Africa is going to change. Well, this report suggests that over the next few years, as Africa's middle class grows, as it becomes a wealthier set of nations, then the US would start to consider doing reciprocal deals in which they get trade benefits back. Now, the African trade ministers have sort of pushed back a bit against this and said, hold on a minute, we've still got a long way to go. Please, let's not talk about doing it reciprocally. Let's talk about the ways in which we can cooperate. And indeed, on a practical scale, I think the US is trying to do as much as it can to ensure that there are success stories from AGOA, things like encouraging regional specialization, finding ways to better target small and medium-sized enterprises, female leadership in middle and small-sized enterprises. Lots of different detailed ways in which the US is trying to make this thing work. But certainly there is agenda beyond AGOA, and that still has a lot of debate to go. Back to you.
Quite interesting. Well, many thanks, Daniel, for those insights. Daniel Ryntjes, of course, joining us in Washington, D.C.